Firstly, democratic political tragedy unfolds in context marked by the socio-political and economic situation that Chile Mbembe has referred to as the post-colony. And when Mbembe uses the term the post-colony in place of what we traditionally refer to as post-colonialism or the post-colonial condition, he wants to stress the continuation of colonial type relations both inside and outside of the developing country, even after the formal ending of colonial rule. Okay, and so he wants to stress mainly the continuation that these relations that existed during colonialism, they actually persist even after the formal ending of colonial rule and the emergence of national independence. The second feature is that, and this is from the first, is that in that context, in the context of the post-colony, one comes across vulnerability, political, social, and economic vulnerability on the part of the developing states. The developing state, meaning Africa and the Caribbean, or it could be elsewhere in the South. One comes across a particularly interesting dialectic of confrontation, wherein at a given political moment, the people in these developing states, they find themselves faced with a situation where they must make a choice. And the choice is usually between pursuing the imperatives of national independence, usually distributive forms of justice, and issue of national sovereignty, as opposed to pursuing the imperative of economic development. Okay? And when these things come into dialectical opposition, a choice must be made, and it is within the making of this choice that we come across democratic political tragedy, as I want to present it here. And then the third component of democratic political tragedy, and this is how we get to Mandela, is usually the presence of a very influential, larger-than-life political leader. And this larger-than-life political leader encounters his or her tragic fall in the midst of the choices that must be made within the context of democratic political tragedy. This larger-than-life, the third feature of democratic political tragedy in the post-colony is the presence of a popular democratic leader who initially embodies the progressive democratic aspirations of the majority of the people in the post-colony at a given historical moment. Such a historical moment usually presents an important juncture in the social, political, and economic development of the democratic state. The thwarting of those popular progressive aspirations on a grand scale entails also the tragic form of a popular democratic leader who in that moment loses moral and political purpose in lieu of the sort of compromises that a limited view of economic development in the neoliberal capitalist framework demands. Okay?
The conceptual introduction of Africa played one of the largest roles in allowing Césaire to fully realize the complexity of his being in the life world. Césaire's introduction to and discovery of Africa restored to his sense of identity a dimension that it lacked. The significance of this reattachment to Africa and to a sense of cultural and historical belonging can be seen most clearly through his discussion and development of negritude, and can perhaps be seen most notably in the 1939 publication of his epic poem Cahiers d'un Couteau et Métal, or Notebook of a Return to My Native Land.
Camus' classic essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, mentions Melville's Moby Dick in terms of its world-making power. He writes that Melville, along with other European modernists, can be considered philosophical novelists. That is, novelists who seek to create a world, but one on a human scale. Well, to think is first of all to create a world, or to limit one's own world, which amounts to the same thing. It's starting out from the basic disagreement that separates man from his experience in order to find a common ground according to one's nostalgia, a universe hedged with reasons or lighted up with analogies, which, in any case, gives an opportunity to rescind the unbearable divorce. Melville, along with a host of European writers such as Kafka and Proust, are said by Camus to be capable of this art of world creation. But this all remains quite abstract, despite what Camus may have intended. C.L.R. James's analysis of the world of Moby Dick is much more concrete. It conveys an existential urgency, sometimes lacking among those thinkers more typically identified as existentialists. Finding oneself detained at Ellis Island on charges of subversion during the heyday of McCarthyism in the United States likely had something to do with the sense of urgency that animates James's mariners, renegades, and castaways. Although undoubtedly suggestive, Camus' comments on Melville and Moby Dick are not nearly as developed as James's interpretation. Camus claims that Melville's novel creates a world, but James does Camus one better by claiming that Melville's novel creates our world. So the difference is, I'm claiming there's an important difference between creating a world and creating our world. The first part of my paper examines this claim through a reading of Camus' text before turning subsequently to James's examination of Moby Dick.
The African's transmogrification into the bestial slave and the erasure of ancient Africa from the narrative of Western history are represented in Enlightenment discourses of scientific racism and Hegelianism, both of which are refuted by David Walker's appeal and Frederick Douglass's speech, The Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered, in the 19th century, as Chapter 1 explains. Although Western radical theory does not possess the egregious racist doctrines of traditional Western theory, Karl Marx's blind spot towards the global import of what I have termed the African diasporic proletariat is tied to the third aspect of Western discourse, the denial of chattel slavery's centrality to the birth of capitalism and empire. While Marx noted chattel slavery's import to the birth of capitalism, he rather myopically relegated Western slavery's economic import to the category of primitive accumulation of the pre-industrial era. This point is discussed in Chapter 2's analysis of W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction and C.L.R. James's The Black Japanese. It must be noted that the institution of chattel slavery catalyzed existential awareness of being and freedom among slaves and South scholar activists like Douglass. The ancestors' quest for liberation could not be cleaved from their self-identification as slaves and members of an oppressed collectivity. Thus, being and freedom are apprehended on both the individual and collective levels. This very existential imperative, which lies behind Black radical resistance to Western oppression, is borne out in Cedric Robinson's groundbreaking text, Black Marxism, through his theory of collective ontological totality. Robinson's incisive analysis of slave rebellions urges readers to consider the comparatively small number of white casualties as evidence that, quote, the slave rebellion was not inspired by an external object. It was the renunciation of actual being for historical being, the preservation of the ontological totality granted by a metaphysical system that never allowed for property in either the physical, philosophical, temporal, legal, social, or psychic senses, end quote. Triumph lay in the enslaved Africans' steely determination to defy oppression and reassert their humanity and agency within a system created to annihilate any form of self-identification that extended beyond that of their owner's property.
And that alienation is this idea of an exsanguination, right? This bleeding out of the black subject. So because this subject is dead, has no family ties, right? Doesn't exist in the history as recognized by the other. There's a way in which writing, right? And this is Abdul John Muhammad's argument, that writing is opposed to this kind of social death. The problem, however, is that we get into an issue of science, formation, right? Who then becomes the subject that represents this type of death? If we look at Saida Hartman's work, she argues that this is the black female slave. She says that the extremity of necropolitics in Dembe is exhibited in the fact that the black female slave, which has to go not only through racism but additional violence and rape, becomes the subject par excellence in terms of how we think about the extremities of power as well as the reality of death. My work wants to argue otherwise. Not in terms of arguing about the subject, but using Winters to say, what is the formulation of both the historical and the conceptual conditions of how we think about death generally, the black corpse, and then how are black men specifically left out of this history of sexual violence given the gender category. So today the black intellectual writes and assimilates blackness into the colonial categories of disciplines to escape the brutality of actual death, real physical death, and attempts to distance themselves from this death through class mobility and social recognition, making themselves the black intellectual class able to observe the dying of black folk from afar. It is because of this necrophobia, being seen as the nigger that must be killed, this running away from death of those other blacks, that blackness is written out of the academic enterprise generally, forcing conceptual expressions of convergence and canonical imitation, and black maleness is altogether ignored and erased specifically. Thought of only as pathological, the platform which from other gendered categories and discourses form a reaction towards. In spite of the world before us, where young black boys, children, are murdered by the state and other white vigilantes for their potentiality and propensity to become black men, academic writing, the research it aims to convey, remains categorically indifferent to the contradictions that black maleness holds in a white supremacist state that only denies masculinity to black men and boys, but imposes patriarchy upon them concretely in the unfettered and accepted violence against them wielded not only by white men and women, but rationally enforced by the state. For these studies, the writing about is not enough. The erasure of the black male from philosophical and conceptual study is not the result of a failure to attend to, but rather a deliberate attention to the need to displace and eliminate the reality of black male deaths and violence against black boys, our children, to enforce a division between disciplinary knowledge and the problem people observed as objects of study. So what I'm suggesting here is that this is not only a problem of not recognizing black men. This is not an issue about recognition. Don't get that mistake. Let's not go there, right? So I'm not trying to substitute one subject, the black male, for another subject, the black female, the black queer body, etc. What I'm suggesting is that because we look at an academic enterprise as a distance from, a position from which we can observe problem people, then we have to in many ways erase the ways in which black men have a central place in anti-black violence in black communities and actual black existence. Because in the academy, we're arguing about universals, we're arguing about ideal subjects, right?
I'm an ethicist by training, and so I'm really concerned about how do we talk about kind of an ethics of life for black men and boys. More than 40 years have passed since Richard Nixon initiated a war on drugs. Within the last decade or so, it has become increasingly clear to criminologists, sociologists, historians, legal scholars, and politicians that the war on drugs is one of the failed projects of American social policy. Scholars such as Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, Houston Baker, Tricia Hill Collins, and organizations such as the Simpson Project and the U.S. Department of Justice under the leadership of Eric Holder have in explicit and inadvertent ways called for the end of the war on drugs. These voices have articulated the negative consequences of American drug policy, which has negatively affected at least 2 generations of mostly black men, women, and children. The war on drugs has instigated a social condition that is tantamount to human conditions that were produced in the U.S. South after the Civil War. In more global terms, the war on drugs has produced levels of human underdevelopment that are comparable and even rival the economic and political neglect that is characteristic of the so-called Third World. Hence, the forms of poverty and disenfranchisement that one finds throughout the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa, to name a few, exist in the United States. The global consequence of the war on drugs is that America leads the world in incarceration. It is now a taken for granted fact, at least for 2 decades, that it has led the world in human warehousing. This paper is concerned with the moral / ontological logic which has legitimated the war on drugs and the past and present moral responses within the black public sphere which have sought to overcome it. In a word, I'm concerned with a priori moral assumptions, the ontological underpinnings of the war on drugs and their connections to the lives of black men and boys. I want to render these assumptions problematic and detrimental to any and all discussions of black men and boys. This paper is a work in historicism. As such, it seeks to historicize and humanize how we talk about and engage the conditions attendant to the lives of black boys and men. This paper, again, is a preliminary effort in a long-term project which is concerned with black masculinity and the Western imagination.
The praxis of liberation speaks from and within the concerns of human experiences in the life world. I here suggest a few benefits of a more straightforward and unabashed deployment and appropriation of Levinas's existential phenomenology to the ethical and political praxis of liberation. The general question that I ask here is the following: what purpose can or does the phenomenological method serve in the praxis of human liberation? Of course, this is too large of a question for one conference paper or even one person to answer, so I'll carve out and elucidate one dimension of it. For the purposes of this presentation, as a textual desideratum, I'm intentionally disregarding Enrique Dussel's insistence that his philosophical contributions be kept in separate isolation from his theological and his ecclesiological studies. As such, I contend that Enrique Dussel's many works in the history, theology, philosophy, ethics, economics, pedagogics, erotics, and politics of liberation are of a piece. That is to say, they speak both to and from the same set of practical concerns. What they articulate and sympathetically analyze is what Levinas has called the cry of ethical revolt, a bearing witness to responsibility.
for Beauvoir, individual identity and freedom are conditioned by the possibility for intersubjective recognition as well as the development of project within an ambiguous relationship between the self, others, and the elusive social world. Following from this, we must understand individual freedom as socially mediated by others and unable to be grounded without the existence of the others who are both free themselves and desire the freedom of others. Nevertheless, throughout history, this foundation for the possibility of freedom has often been lacking, and more so for some groups than others. In this paper, I moved from looking at the development of consciousness of the oppressed to that of the oppressor in order to question the role that the individual plays in constituting her attitude towards her situation as privileged. So similar to the spectrum of oppression, where we find for Beauvoir a range spanning from the most dehumanizing forms of objectification to subordination, there exists a spectrum of privilege. This spectrum of privilege manifests through a variety of attitudes that one may have assumed towards one's privilege, such as indifference, denial, and guilt, as well as capacities for expression of social power.
So according to this position, there is no possibility of capturing human life as a whole, or self as a whole. And Sartre has numerous passages where he talks about the Aristotelian notion that one can be happy only when one no longer exists, right? That only death defines us. Yet when Sartre studies human life as a writer, in numerous biographies, novel, and of course in his own autobiography, he attempts to grasp and define the subject's being, to portray life as a unified whole. Indeed, writers must decide which of life's episodes to include and which to omit, and by so doing they judge the nature of their subject's life, declaring that here in front of us is a person's life, a unified life, whose multiple and variable moments are worthy of exploration under the heading of one's story. It seems surprising then that Sartre, who so strongly insisted on the subject's lack of being and on the inability to grasp it, that being as a whole, was occupied with, or indeed dedicated to writing those biographies, composing fictional texts that deal with the formation of identity, for instance, the short story Childhood of a Leader, and often reflected on the nature of his own selfhood in his diaries and his own autobiography words. Or perhaps it is not surprising at all. Perhaps biographical and autobiographical texts, just like fictional texts, do not merely disclose the unity of life, but rather create something new. They do not represent an already complete self, but constitute their subject. If this is the case, then writing a life story and presenting it in a narrative form is crucial for the ability to view life as a whole. The text enables us to grasp life as the life of one person, or put differently, it brings the subject to life. In this paper, I argue that the subject is structured as a narrative, and I offer a sketch for an existentialist narrative theory that supplements this claim.
This theme of my paper is Looking Through the Middle Passage, Population Genomics, Genealogy, and Race. The development of the sequencing of the human genome has at once offered a tool for diasporic peoples to reconnect with the African continent, yet simultaneously reinvigorated debates about the scientific reality of race. This paper considers some of the existential implications of developments in the field of genomics for blacks in the diaspora, who have historically been deprived of specific connection to their African roots. The cultural and spiritual loss that is a result of the slave trade has driven those in the diaspora to search for and cultivate knowledge about the peoples and cultures of the continent. That need for knowledge and for a sense of rootedness has been revived with the advent of population genomics, as it promises to find the link between contemporary diasporic blacks and their distant African cousins. It is not surprising that this quest for knowledge has generated an industry to provide testing and interpretation of those results. In previous work, I've examined the testimonials of individuals who have opted to submit DNA samples to one of the companies offering this service. This paper expands that work by examining more deeply both population genomics and the desire of many African Americans and other African diaspora people to use this technology to fill in their lost past. In that study, I saw two broad types of people who purchased these ancestry tests offered by one particular company, and I'll get to that a little later. One group had actively been retracing their genealogy for years, if not decades. The other group was not involved in genealogical research, but instead used this service to give themselves a sense of rootedness in a particular people or peoples on the African continent. So, cultural loss through the Middle Passage. What happens to people with no history, or who are, as Dr. Gordon says, invisible to history? How does the consciousness of someone who is unable to place himself in history develop? Merleau-Ponty explains that, quote, "I am everything that I see, and I am an intersubjective field, not in spite of my body and my historical situation, but rather by being this body and this situation, and by being, through them, everything else." Both history and temporality are part of the radical cogito, those things that help to construct an individual's phenomenal field. The ability to connect to both a personal past, what happened last year, and a broader historical past, what happened 200 years ago, that results in part in me being here, are both important. Having a sense of both spatiality and temporality allow one to understand how one's perceptive capacity is structured.